Imagine scattering the ashes of your late husband in the mountains, only to find that they were not his remains at all. Imagine learning that while you were grieving, his body was still lying in a dark, unrefrigerated room at the funeral home you had paid to take care of his cremation. In 2023, nearly 200 families in Colorado discovered that their last goodbye hadn't actually happened. This is the Return to Nature funeral home scandal. Welcome back to 5 Seconds to Sundown. I'm your host Gemma, and if you're new here, this is where I talk about crime and justice, dark history, and the occasional ghost story. Thank you so much for joining me. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments which cases you'd like me to look into next. As always, I'll include a trigger warning. This episode contains discussion of death, irresponsible post-death care, and the mishandling of human remains. And please note that I covered this case on my old podcast, but since there have been updates, I thought I would tell the story again over here on 5 Seconds to Sundown. Let's go back to October 2023 in the quiet small town of Penrose in Colorado. It's the kind of place where neighbours notice when something feels off. And something did feel off in 2023. The building used as a funeral home looked neglected. Weeds were pushing through the concrete out front. The paint was fading. It was kind of abandoned. But it was also how it smelled. Neighbours reported a strong, foul odour coming from the property. But they also noticed that there was a sign outside the business stating that taxidermy was practiced on the premises. Which is random, but fair. The Department of Regulatory Agencies said that they would come down, and they asked the proprietor, John Halford, to accompany them. When they got there, John did not turn up, so they couldn't examine the area. Instead, they went back and got a warrant to search the building later that night, which means that they didn't need John to be there with them. When they finally got inside, they were shocked to find decomposing bodies everywhere inside the building. They were stacked on top of each other. The building was considered a biohazard area because not only was the place infested with flies, but the investigators had to wear hazmat suits to wade through the shin-deep fluid that covered the inside of the building. The business, which was called Return to Nature Funeral Home, advertised itself as an environmentally friendly alternative to traditional death care. They didn't use embalming chemicals or heavy, fancy caskets. They advertised what they did as simple and natural, return to the earth funerals. But when authorities entered the building with a search warrant, they were not prepared for what they found. Nearly 200 decomposing bodies, improperly stored, unrefrigerated, and stacked on top of each other. Some had been there for months, but some, investigators later determined, had been there for years. Not only that, but the building was infested with insects. The air was so contaminated that hazmat crews had to suit up before entering. One first responder even described it as a scene from hell. Another said it felt like walking into a horror movie. And this place was a licensed funeral home. Furthermore, every single one of those bodies belonged to someone who had been sent there with the assumption that they would be treated with care. So, as I said, Return to Nature marketed itself as an eco-friendly option. And to be clear, there's nothing about green burials that should be considered inherently suspicious. Many funeral homes do this, respectfully and ethically. I'm personally a fan. But in this case, chemical-free didn't mean environmentally conscious. It simply meant neglected. Families believed their loved ones had been cremated, and they believed that the ashes had since been returned. They believed burials had taken place. In reality, bodies were being stored, or rather abandoned, inside the building. Because here's what makes this case so grotesque. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was deception. This whole business was a scam. So who owned this business? Well, the funeral home was owned by a married couple named John and Carrie Halford. They purchased Return to Nature in 2016 with the business plan to sell funerals that were based in simplicity and affordability. But behind the branding, investigators allege that the operation was chaos. Instead of maintaining refrigeration systems and proper storage, bodies were placed on shelves in a unit that, according to court filings, was known to be faulty. It broke, and then it wasn't fixed. Ever. But the bodies kept coming. When the supposed refrigeration unit filled up, remains were stacked in the surrounding rooms. There was no order, and even worse, there were no records being kept as to who was who. So, in essence, there was no dignity for those being kept there. And I have to tell you, there weren't just adult bodies. There were babies and even fetuses, according to some reports. And while this was happening, the bodies, the funeral bookings, and the money kept flowing in. Even though the bodies weren't being cremated, they didn't have their own crematory equipment, so they'd been using a third-party business to get it done. But they just stopped doing that too. And that's when they started to stockpile the bodies. So what were the Halfords delivering to the families of these deceased people, if not actual cremated remains? Well, families who paid for cremations received bags of what they were told were their loved ones' ashes. But investigators discovered bags of concrete and a blender in the building. Return to Nature had been giving families concrete powder or concrete powder mixed with unidentified human cremains. And one of the ladies who was given these apparent remains dropped a little bit of water into a tiny scoop of the remains, and they solidified. Others may have received commingled human remains, unidentified cremains that could not be matched to any individual. One woman said she scattered her husband's ashes in the mountains, and later she learned that they weren't even his. She said it felt like losing him all over again. And for some families, there weren't even fake ashes to hold on to, because not all of the bodies inside Return to Nature funeral home were identified. Some had presumed they'd been buried years ago, and that's how long some of them were actually kept inside the building, which means some families will never know where the bodies of their loved ones even ended up. So where were the Halfords when all this came to light? When police came to Return to Nature and requested they meet them at the premises, they didn't turn up. The Halfords left town and headed to Oklahoma. Furthermore, they turned off their phones. They took their children, and for a month, they disappeared. Meanwhile, the story exploded. It made international headlines. It was reported that 191 bodies had been left inside the Return to Nature building. As I said before, this business was actually a scam. And as more details emerged, so did allegations of financial misconduct. Federal investigators alleged the couple had taken nearly $900,000 in pandemic relief funds, money intended to keep struggling businesses afloat during the COVID lockdowns, and they spent it on a lavish lifestyle. They were spending money on cars, going on shopping sprees, and they were even planning to start a second funeral home in another state, while their existing dumpster fire of a business was literally falling apart. All while families grieved and bodies decomposed. So how do you charge something like this? At the state level in Colorado, prosecutors filed 191 counts of abuse of a corpse. But there was also theft, fraud, forgery, and money laundering. At the federal level, the charges focused on money, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and pandemic relief fraud. In June 2024, John Halford was sentenced in federal court. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and he received 20 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay over $1 million in restitution to families. Now that's 20 years just for the fraud, not for the bodies. Don't forget, this is both a federal case and a state case. John Halford's legal team has since appealed that sentence for the federal case. So the federal case was about deception, pandemic funds, financial crimes. But for many families, that wasn't the most traumatising part. Both John and Carrie Halford attempted plea agreements at the state level, hoping that their sentences would be run concurrently with the federal time. In simple terms, they would serve it all at once. But the judge was not having it and rejected the deal. Judge Eric Bentley described rejecting a plea agreement as an extreme action reserved for the most extreme cases. So he was taking this very seriously. As of now, Carrie Halford has pleaded guilty federally, but has not been sentenced at the state level. She is set to be sentenced on April 24, 2026, and could be facing a prison term of 25 to 35 years for her role. There was a lady in the Curious Case of documentary on HBO Max, which featured an episode on this case. Her name was Christina, and the body of her son David had been given to the care of Return to Nature 4 years previous to the story breaking. 4 years. Christina saw the story, but because she'd long received David's ashes, she thought this was a fairly recent development. When her son David was identified as one of the victims of the Return to Nature scandal, Christina was forced to face the unimaginable truth that the ashes that she had been given were not those of her son. Another lady named Heather was not listed as a victim in the case against the Halfords, even though she was. And that's because her son Zach's remains were never identified. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a victim of this heinous crime. Heather entrusted Return to Nature with the care of her son after his death. They let her down. And you have to imagine the anger, the humiliation, and the grief that this must cause. The sense of violation. In a time of weakness, these families were scammed. After the investigation at Return to Nature, the cleanup took 6 days and probably cost a fortune. There were hazmat crews and environmental teams. After the remains were removed and the investigation documented the scene, the building was demolished. Clean soil was brought in to cover the ground, and a ceremony was held for the victims. Not because they didn't already have funerals, but because those funerals may have all been built on a lie. Colorado has since tightened regulations around the funeral industry. Before this case, opening a funeral home required shockingly little regulation. I read somewhere that it's easier to open a coffee truck than a funeral home in Colorado. But now, licensing requirements have been increased and inspections are prioritised. For months, the question hovered over this case. What is the sentence for something like this? Well, on 7th of February 2026, that question was answered. John Halford was sentenced to 40 years in prison for corpse abuse. During the sentencing hearing at the El Paso County Judicial Building, family members told Judge Eric Bentley that they had recurring nightmares about decomposing flesh and maggots since learning what happened to their loved ones. They called defendant John Halford a monster and urged the judge to give him the maximum sentence of 50 years. One woman, Kelly McKean, told the court, "I'm a daughter whose mother was treated like yesterday's trash and dumped in a site left to rot with hundreds of others. She said she prays every day for grace." Judge Eric Bentley acknowledged the weight of what stood before him. He said, "It is my personal belief that every one of us, every human being, is basically good at the core. But we live in a world that tests that belief every day. And Mr. Halford, your crimes are testing that belief." John Halford himself addressed the court. He said, quote, "I had so many chances to put a stop to everything and walk away, but I did not. My mistakes will echo for a generation. Everything I did was wrong." Prosecutors said the couple was driven by greed. They were earning enough to properly care for the bodies, but they chose not to. And here's something else about John Halford that might give you an idea as to his character. In 2006, after going through mortician school, he had tried to start a career as a small town politician in Muskogee City Council in Oklahoma. But his political career came crashing to the ground very suddenly when he and a friend staged a fake hold-up as a joke when they burst into a house with a group of ladies having a slumber party and held AK-47s to their heads. He later pled guilty to a misdemeanor and was ordered to do community service. He was also not able to run for election as a result. It's also worth mentioning that John Halford, during the time that Return to Nature was stockpiling bodies, was having an affair. And he told his girlfriend that he had built the refrigeration system to keep the bodies in, but he claimed that it had been faulty, which it was. He told her he just hadn't fixed it. He just kept putting the bodies in there on the shelves until there was no more room, and he just started stacking them in the surrounding rooms. Investigators also found that John Halford had been travelling around the country as an amateur comedian and making comedy TikToks instead of looking after his own business, the funeral home. So that's the up-to-date news I have on the Return to Nature case. This case is not singular, it is not unique. Sadly, there are multiple cases just like this one from all around the world of funeral homes either becoming overwhelmed with the amount of bodies that they've committed to looking after, or they just don't care. So with that in mind, everybody please just stay safe out there, look after each other, be nice to each other, and I will see you in the next video.